Hello and welcome to Louise Singleton Creations. In today's video I will be using a range of Let's Resin products with the addition of patterned paper to create a pair of magical sea-themed resin bookends using a layered collage technique. I was completely blown away by the finished results and I think you will be too. So if that sounds interesting, stay tuned and enjoy the video. Here are the moulds I'm using today. They're the bookend moulds from Let's Resin. And the cool thing about these is if you look closely on the back, it tells you the volume of the mould. And there are lots of Let's Resin moulds that have that on the back. And I find it really useful. So each of these is 22.9 fluid ounces, I think. I'll have to double check on that. It's quite hard to see the numbers, but they are there if you look carefully. As you already know, I'm using paper in my resin today. This collection of paper is called Songs of the Sea and it's from Stamperia, and there's so much to choose from in this book of scrapbooking paper. I love the style, the theme and the colours of this paper. It's just so gorgeous, and yeah, it took me a long time to choose which pictures I wanted to use in my bookends, but I did get there in the end. Here I'm just giving you a glance at all the different papers in the book. Before I could make my final decision on the different pictures and elements I was going to use, I needed a template so I could check the size. So I took a sheet of acetate, lined it up on the top of the mould. I lined it to the corner so I didn't have to, draw around the whole shape of the mould, just the curve. So once that was lined up, I traced the curve and then cut it out. Then I had my template. And with that I was able to go through the book, lining up the images to the template to see what would fit. And it was quite tricky to plan, but I did get there in the end, and I ended up with several pictures for the different layers in my bookends. And as if by magic, here's all the different elements that I cut out, and I've arranged them in the order that I want them to be when they're in the resin later on. I took a photograph to help me for my reference later. When you're using paper in resin, really you need to seal it, and you do have several options for that. You can use spray varnish, and I would use several layers if you're using spray varnish. Some people use Mod Podge or PVA glue. I've tried them all. I do like the spray varnish, but in this instance I'm going to be laminating it. I find that that's the very best way for jobs like this anyway, to make sure the resin doesn't seep into the paper. And if you're curious to know what's the problem if the resin seeps into the paper, well, it's not exactly a problem. You could put resin onto the paper without, any problem at all. It doesn't seem to warp it in any way, but what it does do is it darkens the image and everything just looks very dark and the image loses its clarity. So yeah, that's why I don't like the resin to soak into the paper. Anyway, what you can see happening here is me just clipping holes in those tag shapes, because later on I'm going to be threading tassels through them. So at this stage I got a little bit ahead of myself. I started arranging all of my paper into the laminating pouch, and then just as I got it completely filled up with all my images, I had a think. I thought to myself, hang on a minute, you're missing a really good opportunity here to add some extra detail. And so what I ended up doing was taking it all back out again and adding some gold to some of the edges, and I'll show you how I did that now. You have several options when it comes to adding detail to the edges of your paper. You could use an ink pad to make it look distressed. You could tear it to make it look, that nice torn effect that you get. Or you can do what I'm doing here and use a glue pad instead of an ink pad. Make it a little bit sticky and then sprinkle on mica powder of your choice. And I've got a really nice strong coloured gold one here, which I'm adding onto the gluey edges to just give it a little bit of that gold touch and make it really stand out in the finished piece. After I'd done that on several pieces, I put it all back into the laminating pouch and put it through my laminator. After that was done, I used my scissors to cut it out, leaving a 3mm margin. If you cut too close to the edge of the paper, you might find that the laminate hasn't bonded together right next to the picture, and that could leave spaces for the resin to leak in between. So I always like to leave a little bit of a space when I'm cutting out. So then I punched a hole again in the tag-shaped pieces, but this time the hole was slightly smaller so that I still had that margin even in the hole. I didn't want resin leaking in any place. So because I'll be pouring my bookends in about 5 layers, I'm using fast cure resin to, speed up the process a little bit. And because it's the fast cure resin, it does tend to be very thick, and I like to warm it up first in my resin preheater, also from Let's Resin. And that really helps to get a clear finish without too many bubbles. And you can also use a bubble removal machine if you like. I like to use mine from Let's Resin. Everything's from Let's Resin today, if you haven't noticed, apart from the paper. So yeah, I do like to use that bubble removal machine. It's such a handy tool. And you'll see that in a moment. But first of all, we've got to get that first layer of paper ready. I decided to use some beads on my paper, but I didn't want them floating to the top of my layer of resin. So here I'm just attaching them with some hot melt glue. So these beads were a necklace that I've had for a long time, and I never wear it, so I thought I might as well use it, and the colours worked perfectly with the colours in the paper. I was so pleased with the way they matched. It was like they were made for it, and yeah, they worked very well in this project. So yeah, there you see, I've worked out exactly where I want it, glued it on, and then it's ready to go in the resin. On my silicone pot, I used a marker pen to mark out the 4-ounce mark and the 8-ounce mark, because I want to use 4 ounces of resin for each layer. And obviously I've got 2, so I need 8 ounces of resin. The fast cure resin is a 1-to-1 mixing ratio by volume. And if you're wondering about the glass jars, those are what I purchased to fit nicely into my resin preheater machine. They just work so well because you can put the lid on and then you can put it in the resin preheater with the preheater's lid on as well. So yeah, if you just put your mixing cups in the resin preheater, you wouldn't be able to add the lid because you could get like water vapour in there. So the closed jar works really well. And I never have resin bottles that are small enough to fit into the preheater. Anyway, here it is in the bubble removal machine, which isn't essential, but it definitely helps. And yeah, I've got most of the bubbles out, as you can see. Once the resin was mixed and degassed, it was time to pour it into the moulds, and I had to be very careful to try and get the same amount into each mould. I wanted to keep it even, but luckily they're quite transparent and I could see from the edges with them together that they were both even. So that really helped being able to see through the moulds. So once all the resin was in, all I had to do was add my first layer, make sure it was completely submerged and pop any bubbles that I could see. Once the first layer was cured, it was time to add my next images. I'm using some glue stick just to make sure they stay in position. And yeah, it's just some small images I'm adding at this stage. And yeah, that's as simple as it is really. There's not much to say. So once those were all stuck down, I added my next layer of resin just in the same way as before. With that layer cured, it was time to start adding the slightly bigger pictures, and at that point I could start to see it really taking shape, and I was starting to get really excited. So yeah, let's put those main pictures in and then the next layer of resin. So once I'd added my resin, I decided to give it a little bit of sparkle with some crushed glass. This is champagne coloured crushed glass pieces from Laura's Art Corner, and they really did make a difference. I didn't put too many in, just a few here and there, and that little bit of sparkle just added a little something. So for the next layer, I decided to start adding some steampunk style ephemera. I've got some cogs here, little brass and silver coloured cogs, and I'd just been having a little play around with them to see where they would look good. That's why you can see some already there, but they're not stuck down yet. I was just seeing what position looks good. So once I decided on the position, I did need to stick them down. And for this, I decided to use UV resin. I could have used my hot melt glue gun again, but it would have been a bit fiddly. They were already in place, and it's so much easier with the UV resin just to add a tiny little drop on top of each of the cogs. Well, not completely on top, half on top of the cog and half on top of the layer of resin, just to very quickly and easily bond them together. And once there was a drop on each one, I took my wireless UV lamp from Let's Resin, which is so handy because you don't have to have it plugged in. So I just reached over for that and quickly cured the UV resin, and I was ready for the next step, which was to add the text. And this time I did use hot melt glue because I wanted it to be slightly raised. The layer that I was sticking it onto was quite uneven because of the beads, and so I needed to compensate for that by doing a thick layer of hot melt glue on one side to get it levelled up again. And yeah, that was as simple as it was really. Once the hot melt glue was dry, I could add my next layer of resin. Right, all the papers in, that last layer that I did has cured, and I still have space left. So what I decided to do was use some seashells and a few other bits and bobs at the front just to give it some more interest. So I got out my collection of shells and sea glass, and I also added some more of the cogs and some glitter, all sorts of different bits and bobs stuck down with hot melt glue, making sure that I left a little bit of space at the edge, the bottom edge, so the resin could get in there. I didn't want to be touching the side of the mould with my shells and things. And I think that was probably the most fun part of the whole project, if I'm honest. It was just real good to just add bits and bobs, random bits, because I was trying to give that vibe of treasures found at the bottom of the ocean. So it could have been anything, and yeah, I was just building up that little collection of treasures. When I'd finished adding all my treasures, it was time to add what should have been the final layer, but in reality it just wasn't enough, and so I did need to leave it for a few hours to let it cure enough for me to add a final thinner layer. But I didn't film that part. This was the last layer that I filmed. So let's go forward in time now to the demoulding. Before I go any further, let me give you a piece of advice which I should know by now. I really should know this by now, but my advice would be wear gloves for the demoulding. There's some very sharp edges right at the top that need filing off, and honestly, the number of times I have kind of scraped my knuckles with the sharp edges and made my knuckles really sore. I just don't know how many times I've done that, and I still don't remember to put gloves on for demoulding. So please do wear some gloves. Anyway, I've got to spoil things now by telling you I had to take it away from under the camera and do this in the sink because I was really struggling, and it was much easier in the sink with soap and water in there. So you're not actually going to see the actual demoulding. So what I will do now is a kind of slow reveal instead of the demoulding. And here they are. What do you think? I think they're really, really beautiful. I'm so happy with them. I love everything about them. The colours are perfect, and I love the way those beads worked in there. Yeah, very, very effective result. It was a few layers to do, wasn't it? 5 or 6 layers, but I think it was worth it. And with the fast cure resin, it's not that bad at all. It took about 2, maybe 3 days, I can't think. Yeah, 3 days. Let's say 3 days it took. But yeah, not bad at all, and very, very pretty. And here are lots and lots of pictures because I can never choose my favourite one. So if you've enjoyed the video today, please do give it a thumbs up and subscribe if you would like to. All the links and discount codes for the products used today will be in the video description, and I will see you again next time. Thank you for watching, and bye for now.